Thanks, Jim, and thanks to the organisers for the opportunity to speak about my work. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss some of the ethical challenges associated with research, and particularly clinical trials, in light of changing approaches to Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm going to cover three main areas. I'm going to talk about existing approaches to the ethical challenges in Alzheimer's disease research and clinical trials. And then going to talk about how some of these challenges have changed in the light of a move to secondary prevention and trials with people at earlier stages of the disease process. And then finally, I want to point to the fact that these ethical challenges are associated with a social, political, and economic context for Alzheimer's disease research. And much of the work I'm discussing in this talk is the product of a group effort. So I want to acknowledge the other people who've been involved in that over the last 2 years of work within the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia, the EPAD project. I'm sure many of you are already aware of EPAD, and I'm sure you'll hear more about it over the next couple of days. But in short, EPAD is a joint venture between the European Union and the European pharmaceutical industry to establish a new platform for secondary prevention trials in Alzheimer's disease. And our involvement has been around the ethical, legal, and social implications of that. So this is work that's led by Shirlene Badger and Carol Brain in Cambridge, Ado Richard in Nijmegen, and Luc Troyen at Janssen. And I'd also really like to mention the contribution of Diane Go from Alzheimer Europe and Christa Tromp from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. We also have an independent EPAD ethics advisory board, and I'm also drawing on discussions at a symposium which was sponsored by the Brochet Foundation in Geneva on the ethical and social implications of the redefinition of Alzheimer's disease. So those acknowledgements, I'm the only one who's responsible for the limitations of this talk, so they absolved from it. So in our EPAD work, we've produced guidance and contributed to the kind of practical ethical challenges within the project across a range of areas. So from the recruitment process through consent, the management of data and results within that, and the continuity beyond it. But in this talk, what I'm going to do is try and position this work in a broader field of changes in Alzheimer's disease research and the challenges this presents for protecting the rights and interests of people with dementia, research participants, which often but not always overlap, researchers and society more broadly. So over the past 40 years, basically since the start of a program of clinical trials around Alzheimer's disease, there have been a number of excellent overviews and guidelines and reports on the ethics of Alzheimer's research, including a report from Alzheimer Europe, which is available on their website. And I'm not going to recapitulate these in detail. What I do want to do is emphasize their existence and the fact that there is this long-standing discussion associated with protecting the rights, safety, and well-being of research participants. And that central to much of this work and many of these discussions has been this concern about autonomy and the effect of dementia on the capacity of individuals to provide free and informed consent for research participation. And informed consent is the kind of cornerstone of research ethics. But as the first National Institute of Health conference on ethics and Alzheimer's research concluded in the early 1980s, a model for regulating research predicated on an assumption that potential subjects are competent adults possessing the capacity to evaluate for themselves the potential risks and benefits of participation, and the capacity to withdraw from participation may be ill-suited to the different constellation of facts present in Alzheimer's disease. And this is very much indicative of where a lot of this discussion has come from. And a core challenge of Alzheimer's disease clinical trials has thus been to protect the well-being of people with dementia and avoid them coming to harm, but also ensuring that the rights of people with dementia to participate in research and to self-determination are respected at the same time. And I think there's a real connection here with what Adrian was talking about this balancing autonomy and safeguards. And similarly to the legal questions around continuing power of attorney, and this challenge has been addressed differently in different countries over time through the acceptability and limits of advanced research directives, proxy and surrogate consent. And it's not just these reports that really focus on consent. So this is my only picture, unfortunately. As a sociologist, I'm limited in my pictures, but this is a map of all the research papers talking about ethics and Alzheimer's disease in either the abstract title or keywords. And what you can see is you get particular clusters within this of terms that commonly occur together. So one of them being the idea that there are ethical dilemmas, ethical concerns, ethical issues that we need to think about in the context of research. Then up at the top right, I think it's all okay, you have questions around care, and then down at the bottom you have traditional kind of questions associated with animal research, particularly around the use of animal models, the use of stem cells. And in the middle you have this large cluster of discussion around informed consent, decision-making capacity. But despite this, the ethical challenges associated with Alzheimer's disease clinical trials and research are not limited to capacity, nor narrowly to these kind of questions of research practice. And as a starting point, I want to take a 2000 paper by bioethicists Isser and Kieselink, which identified 4 other areas of ethical challenge in the development of drugs for Alzheimer's disease. So these include questions of research design, such as the use of placebos in Alzheimer's disease trials, which emerged as an issue following the introduction of the first symptomatic treatments in the 1990s, and the ability of Alzheimer's trial design to ensure the production of credible trial data given variability in outcomes, endpoints, and the population included. Other issues include the role of genotyping in the selection of clinical trial participants, something that again arose as a concern following the identification of the first genes associated with Alzheimer's disease and interest in pharmacogenetics. And this shows up in a second cluster of discussions around genetic and predictive testing. And finally, Isser and Kieselink point to ethical challenges associated with drug development and concerns about pharmaceutical industry, access to patients, the potential for conflicts of interest, and the contested economic and social value of the outcomes of trials. This list is by no means the only or the most in-depth analysis of the ethics of clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease, but I introduce it for 2 reasons. The first is that in its discussion of changing treatment regimens and genetic testing, it illustrates that the ethical challenges associated with Alzheimer's disease research evolve and change alongside the science. And secondly, it shows that while questions of informed consent and capacity are important, the ethics of clinical trials encompasses a broader range of questions, many of which are resolved without reflection or debate long before we start to tackle the practical challenges associated with trial conduct and recruitment. And the concerns and challenges outlined in this work remain relevant within contemporary Alzheimer's disease research and trials, not least because the majority of clinical trials still focus on the same mild to moderate stages of Alzheimer's dementia. But approaches to trials are also showing signs of change in response to changing diagnostic understandings of Alzheimer's disease. So instead of stereotypical signs and symptoms such as dementia, Alzheimer's disease has become defined as a biological continuum mapped by biological markers. In turn, this continuum is broken down into distinct stages, so preclinical or asymptomatic at-risk Alzheimer's disease, prodromal Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's dementia. And the hope is that by identifying people in these early stages, we'll ultimately be able to intervene to prevent or slow the emergence of Alzheimer's dementia. And in the short term, it means trials which focus on earlier stages of disease, take place over longer periods, and which may involve biomarker or other intermediate assessments of disease progression. So such secondary prevention research is by definition conducted with people without symptomatic dementia. This means that some of the ethical concerns including the assessment of capacity to consent, may become less acute, though not necessarily. But it also presents its own ethical challenges. And drawing on our EPAD work, I want to focus on 3 areas. So it's study risk and burden, stratification and risk disclosure, and standardization and complexity, or trial design and recruitment. So a core challenge in clinical trials is to ensure that the risks and burdens to participants are identified and assessed, that measures are taken to minimize them, and that they're outweighed by the potential benefits to research subjects and others. And the assessment of risks is particularly important in prevention trials because they involve exposing people to novel agents with possible side effects for an extended period of time. Any benefits to particular individuals may be long-term and difficult to track, and some people will be exposed to experimental interventions but may never develop dementia anyway. And because of the duration and the intensity of trials, the study burden is also important. However, unlike risk, which is in theory quantifiable in some cases, burden has always been a slipperier, more subjective concept. And the burden of secondary prevention trials is not simply that of a novel drug, it's also the lengthy and repeated cognitive testing, the invasive and intensive research procedures that any clinical trial involves. And this risk and burden may have negative implications for recruitment, but they also potentially raise normative questions about who and about how and whom we recruit into trials and what we ask people to do within those trials, what we're willing to ask people to do. But perhaps significantly, we still know little about what it's actually like to take part in such research, or even what the most relevant parameters for assessing the experience of people taking part in clinical trials are. A second challenge associated with prevention trials relates to the potential harms caused to people who learn that they are at increased risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia or are considered to have preclinical or prodromal Alzheimer's disease. Prevention studies often target interventions at people thought to be most likely to develop Alzheimer's dementia, and this involves targeting recruitment either on the basis of genotype, such as ApoE status, or biomarkers, particularly levels of beta amyloid. Neither genetic nor biomarker information is routinely provided to people who have no cognitive symptoms, but targeted trial recruitment may involve communicating these data to people. And there are 2 challenges here. The first involves establishing the validity and the specificity of this information, minimizing the risks of false positives, of communicating elevated risk to people who don't have it. And the second involves establishing whether learning this information is harmful, what it means to people, and how we communicate it. So we know a bit about the effects of disclosing risk status from work on ApoE gene disclosure, and this research suggests that in controlled settings and among first-degree relatives of people with Alzheimer's dementia, few individuals experience significant negative psychological effects on learning that they carry the ApoE4 allele, which is the most significant risk indicator, the genetic risk indicator. And that learning that you don't carry it does result in relief. Compared with learning that you carry a low-risk allele, the information is associated with some test-related distress. People are more likely to take up long-term care insurance, and it may have effects on cognition. But we also need more evidence in this area. So this is from a systematic review that we conducted within our EPAD work, that ultimately we identified 14 studies on this subject, 11 of which are based on a single trial, which is the REVEAL trial of ApoE disclosure. All but one of these studies took place in the US, and none looked at biomarkers. And there are potentially significant differences between a genetic marker that you have, that you're born with and that relates quite closely to your family history, and a biological marker that's an indicator of where you are at the moment. That, as I think Christina pointed to, there are important cultural and social differences around Alzheimer's disease that need to be discussed in this context. So, and some of this we're going to talk about more in, we have a symposium at lunchtime today to talk around the kind of communication of new Alzheimer's disease categories. So I'll throw a trailer in there as well for the next bit. But then to come on to the final challenge that I want to raise here is that of the changing infrastructure around clinical trials. So since the 1980s, Alzheimer's disease research has often involved multi-centre trials. And over that time, there have been periods where variation between centres and a lack of standardised definitions or measures of trial outcome have at times diminished the value of data and consequently the societal benefits that are able to accrue from clinical trials. There are a number of initiatives which aim to standardise the conduct and measurement of trials across sites and which will hopefully contribute to the production of robust outputs from trials. But we also still need valid ways of measuring the long-term effect of drugs, and ideally those which are valuable and relevant to the population being treated. The identification of this population also presents practical and ethical challenges associated with finding a large group of potential research participants, particularly where trials aim to recruit beyond a clinical setting. This has contributed to the creation of new recruitment infrastructures and what you might describe as a move from people with dementia to people with data that can be used to stratify and coordinate recruitment processes. Examples of these new approaches include registries of research-interested individuals, pre-screening procedures, or the combination of observational studies with trial recruitment, as in EPAD, or even the use of routine health records to identify people willing to be contacted for research. These new approaches to Alzheimer's disease trials recruitment present opportunities for better targeted research, but also distinctive challenges associated with the sharing of data, samples, and ultimately the recruitment of participants between studies. And some of these have received attention in ethical guidelines, particularly around data sharing, but others haven't yet. And one thing that we've identified as critically important in EPAD is making sure that as people enter a research pathway that may ultimately result in them taking part in a clinical trial, that the whole research journey should be as transparent to them as practicable and possible. Okay, so finally, what I want to do is to go back to some of those broader concerns or broader questions or challenges or dilemmas introduced by Issa and Kiesling. So I focus quite narrowly on some of the ethical challenges associated with the practice and process of clinical prevention trials. And the focus of this work is very much on ensuring that the research which is conducted respects the rights, dignities, and interests of research participants, minimizes potential harms, and produces valuable and valid knowledge. But these challenges are framed by and are inseparable from the broader social, political, cultural, and economic questions about Alzheimer's disease, Alzheimer's research, and clinical trials. These drive the types of research that we see as being valuable and worthwhile and structure the kind of practical questions that we come to address. And so I want to highlight three areas of particular importance. So the first is the relationship between prevention and symptomatic treatment, or between care and cure. And this is often seen as a zero-sum game in which a growing emphasis on intervening at earlier and earlier stages of biological disease may divert funding and attention away from the day-to-day problems of people with dementia. And it's essential that we take measures to ensure that this isn't the case. And we also need to recognize the connections between the two. So as I've described, one major concern about prevention trials relates to the harm caused by learning one's Alzheimer's disease risk status. And ultimately, the hope is that effective prevention may reduce these concerns. But they're also inextricable from people's fears and expectations of what life with Alzheimer's dementia is like. And in the shorter term, work to improve life with dementia, to develop better care, and to continue to expand the range of stories and images and narratives we associate with dementia may also reduce the harms associated with learning risk. The second relates to the role of hope and hype in shaping research policy, investment, and public interest. So in the early 1990s, the politics of Alzheimer's disease was described as an apocalyptic demography. And this apocalyptic demography creates a powerful imperative for action, a quest for a magic bullet, and the risk of the premature introduction of knowledge or technology. And so there's an ethical challenge for policymakers, research funders, the public, for all of us to critically engage with hype and for researchers to promise responsibly. And the lesson of the early days of the development of the first cholinesterase drug, Tacrim, is salutary here in terms of the ability of hope to shift assessments of scientific validity and then require unpicking and redoing. And then finally, I want to return to the last challenge identified by Issa and Kieselink, that associated with drug development and pharmacoeconomics. So new initiatives in Alzheimer's disease research, such as EPAD and also those driven by the National Alzheimer's Project Act in the United States, increasingly focus on public-private partnerships as the means to deliver advances in Alzheimer's disease. And these represent powerful new ways of advancing science towards effective new medicines, bringing together people who should be talking together in the same room. But we also need to ensure throughout that public and private interests are aligned and that we're alive to the potential longer-term and systemic implications of developing drugs to treat early disease. So, to conclude, excellence in Alzheimer's disease research and trials, to bring this back to the focus of the whole conference, I think requires reflection on and engagement with the ethical challenges of the research that we do. There's a significant body of guidance, research and commentary on the ethics of conducting clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease. And a core concern of this literature has been this development of frameworks to protect the autonomous decision-making process associated with providing consent for research participation. The move to prevention shifts the emphasis to other areas of concern, notably associated with risk and burden and the disclosure of risk status. And addressing these challenges has been central to our work within EPAD. This involves working with people with dementia and potential research participants to develop recommendations around disclosure, the development of educational materials related to risk, and we're currently establishing a research participant panel which will operate at local levels and within the governance structure of the project to provide the opportunity for the study to actively involve participants, learn from their experience, and engage with them on the future of the research. But importantly, and in closing, not all the ethical challenges associated with clinical trials relate to solving practical problems in the conduct of trials themselves, but to the place of these trials within the broader context of Alzheimer's disease research. Ethical challenges are also social and policy challenges, and they require reflection on the bigger picture of what we're trying to treat and why, what sort of future we want to create, and importantly, that this involves a broader discussion with people with dementia, caregivers, research participants, clinicians, industry, and health policy. Thank you.